The sea did not forgive mistakes. It swallowed ships, erased coastlines in fog, and turned even the strongest men into drifting bones beneath gray water. Yet more than 1,000 years ago, Viking sailors pushed their narrow wooden ships out into that danger again and again, crossing nearly 2,000 miles of open ocean with no magnetic compass, no printed charts, and no instruments that would make sense to a modern captain. They sailed from Norway to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland, and even onward to the edge of North America, into waters where storms could rise like walls and where a single wrong decision could leave a crew vanishing into emptiness. To us, it sounds impossible. To them, it was skill, and that skill was built not on luck, but on an extraordinary understanding of the world around them, of winds, waves, birds, stars, memory, and signs so subtle most people would never notice them at all. The popular image of Vikings often begins and ends with violence. Raiders, in helmets, axes in hand, crashing onto foreign shores. But that image hides something just as remarkable as their warfare, their genius as navigators. These were people from a fractured coastline of deep fjords, rocky islands, and cold northern waters, a landscape that trained them from childhood to read the sea as if it were a language. Before a Viking ever faced the open Atlantic, he had likely spent years learning close to shore, moving through channels, memorizing currents, sensing changes in weather, and watching older sailors make decisions that looked almost mystical to outsiders. Navigation was not a separate science locked away in books. It was woven into daily life, passed down through experience, sharpened by risk, and tested by survival. What made this even more astonishing was the nature of their ships. Longships and gnars were masterpieces of engineering, flexible, shallow-drafted, fast, and tough enough to survive violent water, but they were still open vessels in one crucial sense. The sea was never far away. Crews felt every shift in the wind and every slap of waves against the hull. They were not insulated from the environment. They were immersed in it. That closeness mattered because Viking navigation depended on constant sensory awareness. The ocean was not an empty space between 2 points on a map. It was full of information. The trick was knowing how to see it. The first tool Vikings used was not an object at all, it was memory. Routes were preserved in the mind, carried through oral tradition with astonishing precision. Landmarks, sailing directions, seasonal patterns, and distances were remembered through repeated voyages and spoken teaching. A captain might know that a certain route required steering west-northwest for days under a typical summer wind, keeping the swell at a certain angle to the ship, expecting colder air after a set period, and watching for seabirds near dawn once land was within range. That knowledge was not improvised. It came from generations. In an age before charts, the human brain was the chart, and memory alone was not vague storytelling. It was disciplined. The Norse world valued exact knowledge of travel. Icelandic sagas, though written later and shaped by literature, preserve glimpses of how seriously sailing directions were taken. Distances were discussed in terms of days at sea, coasts were described in usable detail. People knew not only where places were, but how they felt to approach. The fog conditions, the timing of favorable winds, the look of the mountains from offshore, even the color of the water near certain banks. A good navigator stored thousands of such details, layering them together until the sea route became a kind of invisible road. Then there was the sun, the oldest guide on Earth. Even without a compass, the movement of the sun provided orientation across the day. In clear weather, this seems straightforward enough: east at sunrise, west at sunset, southward arc through the day. But Viking navigators likely used the sun in more sophisticated ways than simple direction finding. They sailed in northern latitudes where the summer sun behaves strangely, lingering long and low, creating extended twilight and short nights. For crews familiar with these patterns, the sky became a clock and compass together. By tracking the sun's height and position, a skilled navigator could maintain a general course for long periods, especially during the sailing season when voyages were most common. Some historians have also pointed to the possible use of a sun compass or sun shadow board, simple devices that could help estimate direction based on the sun's angle. Archaeological evidence suggests that Norse mariners may have used a wooden disc marked to assist with orientation when the sun was visible. It was not a compass in the later magnetic sense. It did not point north on its own, but in the hands of someone who understood the sky, it could help maintain latitude or correct a ship's heading. These tools were only as useful as the knowledge behind them, which is precisely the point. Viking navigation was never about one magical gadget. It was about a system of observation. But the North Atlantic is rarely generous enough to stay clear for long. Fog, cloud cover, and storms could hide the sun for days. This is where the mystery deepens. Medieval sources mention something called a sunstone, a crystal that may have helped locate the sun even when it was obscured. The exact truth remains debated, but experiments with certain crystals, such as Iceland spar, have shown that polarized light in the sky can reveal the sun's position behind clouds under some conditions. Whether Vikings used such stones regularly, occasionally, or not at all is still uncertain. Yet the idea persists because it fits the larger pattern of Norse seamanship, an ability to pull guidance from conditions others would call blind. Even if the sunstone remains partly speculative, the underlying mindset is not. Viking navigators were experts at using indirect clues. If the sky was hidden, the sea itself still spoke. Swell direction could reveal prevailing winds and distant weather systems. Unlike surface chop, ocean swell carries momentum across vast distances, producing long, rolling patterns that remain stable even when local winds change. A skilled sailor could feel whether the ship was crossing the swell cleanly, drifting off angle, or being nudged sideways. In darkness or fog, this became crucial. The hull transmitted information through motion. A Viking crew, living inches above the waterline, would notice changes modern passengers would ignore. They also watched animals. Birds were particularly valuable. Certain species range far from land, while others rarely stray too far from nesting grounds. If a navigator saw land-based birds flying with purpose at certain times of day, it could suggest a coastline in that direction. Ravens, often romanticized in Viking lore, may indeed have been used in some traditions as living indicators. Release a bird at sea, and if land was near, it might fly toward it. If not, it could circle and return to the ship. Whether this was a standard navigational practice or a rarer technique, the principle reflects a larger reality. Viking sailors did not separate nature into categories. Sky, sea, wind, birds, and whales were all parts of a single navigational field. Smell may even have mattered. Near land, especially in the far north, sailors might detect vegetation, peat smoke, or the scent of seabird colonies before seeing shore. Water color could change as well, especially near shallows, river outflows, or continental shelves. Floating debris, wood, seaweed, bits of plant life could hint at nearby coasts. And then there was ice. In some routes, the presence, drift, and type of sea ice could reveal both danger and location. Greenland voyages demanded this: awareness. Sail too far into the wrong waters, and ice could trap or wreck a vessel. Read it properly, and it became another marker in the vast Atlantic puzzle. This brings us to one of the most important truths about Viking navigation. They did not aim for pinpoint precision in the modern sense. They worked with corridors, zones, and probabilities. A voyage from Norway to Iceland did not require arriving at one exact harbor on the first sighting. It required reaching the right broad band of ocean where Iceland would eventually appear, then adjusting based on local signs. This is how many non-modern navigators worked across the world. Perfection was less important than pattern recognition and correction. Viking sailors accepted uncertainty, but they did not surrender to it. They managed it. Season also shaped everything. Voyages were planned for the times of year when daylight, weather, and sea conditions were most favorable. This alone dramatically improved success. A route that would be suicidal in winter could be manageable in summer. Generations of sailors learned when to depart, how long a crossing usually took, and what winds could be expected. Timing was part of navigation. To leave at the wrong season was not just inconvenient. It could be fatal, and fatal mistakes did happen. Ships were lost, crews vanished. The Atlantic kept many of their failures. That is another reason Viking navigation deserves respect. It was forged in a brutally honest environment. Bad navigators did not become legends. They disappeared. The knowledge that survived was knowledge paid for in timber, blood, and memory. What is perhaps most extraordinary is that this system carried the Norse farther west than any Europeans had gone in centuries. Settlers reached Iceland in the late 9th century. Greenland followed, and then came Vineland, the Norse foothold in North America, centuries before Columbus. These were not random accidents, they were the result of repeated ocean crossings, of navigators able to hold courses across enormous distances with no map spread before them. Somewhere beyond the edge of familiar routes, where cloud and sea merged into a single pale horizon, they trusted signs almost too subtle to believe, and one of those signs, small enough to fit in a hand or hidden in the habits of birds, may have made the difference between finding a new world and never being seen again. And once the Vikings had learned how to find the ocean's hidden roads, they did something even harder. They turned those risky crossings into a network. The voyage west was no longer a single daring leap into the unknown. It became a chain. Norway led to the Faroe Islands. The Faroes led to Iceland. Iceland led to Greenland. Greenland opened the possibility of lands still farther west. Each step made the next one imaginable, but none of them became safe. The Atlantic remained cold, violent, and indifferent. What changed was the Vikings' confidence that it could be read. That confidence rested not only on navigation during the voyage, but on preparation before the ship ever left shore. A successful crossing began in the harbor. The right vessel had to be chosen, and not every Viking ship served the same purpose. The famous longship, sleek and fast, was superb for raiding, coastal travel, and river movement. But for open sea transport, the Nar mattered even more, broader, deeper. And designed to carry cargo, animals, tools, timber, and people, the Nar was the true workhorse of Atlantic expansion. It was not glamorous in the same way, but it was the ship that made colonization possible. A navigator understood the behavior of his vessel intimately, how it handled quartering waves, how much sail it could carry in rough weather, how it drifted under reduced canvas, how much weight it could bear before becoming sluggish or dangerous. Navigation was never abstract. It was always tied to the body of the ship. Crews also had to think in terms of survival margins. How much fresh water could be carried? How much dried fish, grain, or preserved meat? How many days should be expected for a fair crossing, and how many extra days should be assumed if winds failed or storms forced delays? On a modern map, a route looks like a line. For the Vikings, it was a gamble against food, fatigue, and exposure. Too little provision, and a successful course could still end in death. Too much weight, and the ship became less responsive. Every choice narrowed the room for error. And error could come quietly. It did not always announce itself with a dramatic storm. Sometimes it arrived as drift, a gradual unseen push of wind and current over days. A captain might believe he was holding west, while the ship was in fact being carried south or north. This was one reason why Viking navigation demanded constant correction. They were not simply setting out in a direction and waiting. They were checking signs all the time: the angle of the swell, the behavior of the sail, the feel of the wind on the cheek, the position of the sun when visible, the timing of bird sightings, the color and temperature of the air. The voyage was active from beginning to end. To stop reading the environment was to begin losing control. That is also why modern people often underestimate them. We imagine that without metal instruments or paper charts, navigation must have been primitive, almost accidental. But in reality, it may have required more skill, not less. A sailor who relies on instruments may stop noticing the world directly. Viking navigators had no such luxury. Their minds had to combine astronomy, weather sense, memory, seamanship, and environmental pattern recognition into a single living practice. They were not less sophisticated than later navigators. They were sophisticated in a different way. By the time Norse sailors began reaching Greenland, that sophistication was being tested to its limit. Greenland was not just farther west, it was harsher, less forgiving, and surrounded by colder, more dangerous waters. Reaching it required crossing enormous stretches of ocean where rescue was impossible and where ice could alter routes or destroy ships outright. Yet Eric the Red's colonists made the journey, and for generations Norse settlements endured there. That fact alone tells us something essential. Viking navigation was not a one-time miracle. It was reliable enough to sustain movement of people, livestock, trade goods, and communication over long distances. Fragile, yes. Risky, absolutely. But functional on a recurring basis. The Greenland settlements also reveal how navigation depended on social memory. Information did not live in one genius captain alone. It had to be distributed across a culture. Routes, seasons, hazards, and signs were taught and retaught. A younger sailor learned from an older one. A merchant remembered a crossing from 10 summers ago. A settler told of ice conditions on a particular approach. Knowledge accumulated not in libraries but in people. This made Norse navigation powerful but also vulnerable. If voyages became rarer, if experienced seafarers died, if settlements weakened, then the system itself could erode. Knowledge not written down can be incredibly resilient within a living tradition and disturbingly fragile once that tradition begins to break. There may have been moments out on the Atlantic when the difference between success and disaster came down to a single decision made with incomplete information. Imagine a ship in heavy fog, the sun hidden for days, the crew exhausted, the water running low. Somewhere nearby, perhaps, lies land. But in what direction? Turn too far north and you may run into colder water, worsening conditions, or pack ice. Turn too far south and you may miss your target entirely and drift into a much longer, deadlier passage. In that moment, the navigator cannot consult a printed chart or check a needle. He must decide based on fragments. The memory of the last clear sky, the rhythm of the swell, the bird that passed at dawn and did not return, the smell that came and vanished with the wind. This is not guesswork in the careless sense. It is disciplined judgment under uncertainty. And still, sometimes the sea gave no second chance. What makes the Viking story so compelling is that they sailed not only with skill, but with audacity. The Atlantic between Scandinavia and North America is not a narrow sea. It is a system of vast emptiness, weather violence, and deceptive distances. Yet they crossed it in clinker-built wooden ships with wool sails, iron rivets, and human endurance. Their accomplishments were not just geographic, they were cognitive. They expanded the range of what human beings could reliably do using observation, memory, and nerve. And then there is Vinland. The Norse presence in North America, confirmed archaeologically at Lons o Meadows, proves that Viking navigation carried them beyond Greenland into an entirely new continent. This should not be treated as an isolated lucky landfall. To reach Vinland, sailors first had to reach Greenland, then launch onward, then return with enough knowledge to guide others. The sagas describe lands west of Greenland, Helluland, Markland, Vinland in ways that mix memory, storytelling, and oral tradition. The exact routes and sequence of discoveries remain debated, but the broad reality is undeniable. Norse mariners operated across an oceanic sphere much larger than many people realize. Yet even at the height of that achievement, their navigational world had limits. It was powerful, but not infinitely scalable. Viking seamanship worked brilliantly within a certain framework: seasonal sailing, known corridors, accumulated route memory, visible environmental cues, and human transmission of expertise. It did not produce a global system of abstract cartography. It did not create universal coordinates that could be handed to strangers and used anywhere. It was relational, local, embodied. That may sound like a weakness, but it was also a strength. It was perfectly adapted to the world they inhabited. In fact, there is something almost unsettling about how effective it was. Modern people are used to externalizing knowledge into devices. We trust satellites more than our senses, and often for good reason. But the Vikings remind us that the human mind, trained across generations within a demanding environment, can achieve astonishing precision without modern tools. They did not conquer uncertainty. They learned to move inside it. Their success also depended on humility before the sea, though perhaps they would not have used that word. The ocean could be read, but never controlled. The best navigator in the north could still die in a storm. The finest shipbuilder could still watch his hull split on hidden rocks. Skill improved the odds. It never guaranteed survival. That balance between mastery and vulnerability is part of what makes Viking navigation feel so dramatic even now. These were not men floating aimlessly with heroic luck. They were experts confronting a force larger than themselves, armed with knowledge that was real, hard-earned, and still incomplete. Over time, of course, the navigational world changed. Magnetic compasses would spread, chart-making would improve, European seafaring would become increasingly instrument-based. The old Norse methods would no longer stand alone at the frontier of ocean travel. But for a crucial stretch of history, before those later systems matured, Vikings were among the greatest navigators on Earth. Not because they had superior technology in the modern sense, but because they fused technology, memory, landscape knowledge, and sensory skill into a seamless whole. So when we ask how Vikings crossed 2,000 miles of ocean without maps or compass, the answer is not that they somehow ignored the need for navigation. It is the opposite. They navigated constantly. They used the sun when it showed itself and the sea when it did not. They trusted swell patterns, seasonal winds, stars, birds, coast memory, disciplined route traditions, and perhaps even crystals that could catch traces of hidden sunlight in a cloudy sky. They chose the right ships, left in the right seasons, carried the right margins of supply, and accepted that every mile demanded attention. Their ocean was never blank. It was alive with signals, and perhaps that is the real lesson hidden beneath the legend. The Vikings did not cross an empty void. They crossed a world they had taught themselves to perceive more deeply than most of us ever will. Where we imagine nothing but water, they found structure. Where we see chaos, they detected pattern. Where later generations would rely on instruments, they relied on trained senses and inherited memory. That was how they reached Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland. That was how they turned terror into route, distance into connection, and the wide Atlantic into something almost unthinkable, a road.